It is 3:15 in the morning, March 13th, 1964. A young woman named Kitty Genovese is walking home from work through the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens, New York. She is 28 years old. She manages a bar nearby. She knows this street. A man approaches from the shadows. He attacks her with a knife. She screams. She calls out that she has been stabbed. Lights come on in the apartment windows above the street. A neighbor shouts down. The attacker retreats. Kitty tries to make it to her building. She doesn't get there. The attacker returns. He stabs her again. She screams again. More lights come on. He retreats again. He comes back a third time. He finds her in the entrance of a nearby building. He stabs her again. She dies. The attack lasts approximately 35 minutes. The police later report that 38 neighbors heard or witnessed some portion of what happened that night. 38 people. Not one of them called the police until it was over. 38 people looked out of their windows at a woman being murdered on their street, and not one of them picked up the phone. When the story broke in the New York Times, the country was gripped by a single anguished question: what is wrong with people? What kind of person watches that happen and does nothing? Two psychologists named Darley and Latané thought they knew the answer. And they were right, but the answer was not what anyone wanted to hear. Welcome back to the Darkest Experiments. We have spent Chapter 4 inside the psychology of groups, watching boys at a summer camp turn strangers into enemies, watching third graders absorb a hierarchy of cruelty, and then weep when it was lifted. We have been sitting with the uncomfortable truth that human beings are tribal, that belonging shapes behavior, and that the categories we place people in carry real and lasting consequences. The bystander effect is the final piece of this chapter, and it completes the picture in a way that is both deeply troubling and, in its own way, quietly hopeful. Because what Darley and Latané discovered is not that people are cruel or indifferent or cowardly. What they discovered is something far more precise and far more actionable. The year is 1964. The Kitty Genovese story is everywhere. Newspapers, editorials, sociologists, and ordinary people are all wrestling with the same question. How could so many people have done nothing? The prevailing explanations lean toward moral decay, urban alienation, the anonymity of city life turning neighbors into strangers, strangers into bystanders, bystanders into something close to accomplices. The story was being used as evidence that modern society had broken something essential in the human capacity for compassion. Darley and Latané were not satisfied with that explanation. They were social psychologists, and they suspected that what had happened on that street in Queens was not primarily a story about moral failure. It was a story about social dynamics, about the specific psychological conditions created when multiple people witness an emergency simultaneously. Their hypothesis was counterintuitive. They believed that the 38 witnesses had not failed to act despite the presence of others. They had failed to act because of it. They called it diffusion of responsibility. And they designed a series of experiments to prove it. The first experiment was simple in its setup and devastating in its results. Participants were brought into a waiting room and asked to fill out a questionnaire while they waited. Some participants were alone in the room. Others were placed in groups of 3, 2 of whom were, unknown to the real participant, actors trained to behave in a specific way. A few minutes after the participants settled in and began filling out their form, smoke began to drift into the room through a vent in the wall. Not a small, ambiguous wisp, thick, steady, clearly visible smoke filling the room at a rate that any reasonable person would recognize as potentially serious. Here is what happened when participants were alone. 75% of them got up, left the room, and reported the smoke to someone within 2 minutes. They noticed something was wrong. They felt personally responsible for doing something about it. They acted. Here is what happened when participants were in a group, seated alongside 2 actors who had been instructed to glance at the smoke, shrug, and return calmly to their questionnaires. Only 10% reported the smoke. Even as the room filled to the point where they were coughing and waving it away from their faces, the majority of participants stayed in their seats, following the lead of the people around them who appeared unconcerned. They looked to others to interpret the situation. The others appeared calm, so the situation must not be serious. So there was no need to act. This is the first mechanism of the bystander effect, pluralistic ignorance. When we are uncertain how to respond to an ambiguous situation, we look at the people around us for cues. If everyone around us appears calm, we conclude that calm is the appropriate response, even if the room is filling with smoke. Darley and Latané pushed further. They wanted to test not just ambiguous situations, but unambiguous ones. A room filling with smoke could, theoretically, have an innocent explanation. What about something that could not be misread? They designed a second experiment. Participants were told they would be having a discussion about personal challenges with other university students, conducted over an intercom system to protect anonymity. Each person would speak in turn from their own private booth. In reality, all the other voices were pre-recorded. During the discussion, one of the recorded voices, framed as a fellow participant, began to show signs of a medical emergency. He said he was prone to seizures. His speech became slurred. He said he was having one now. He asked for help. He made choking sounds, and then he went silent. This was unambiguous. A person was having a medical emergency. They had asked for help. The question was simply, would the participant do something about it? When participants believed they were the only other person in the discussion, that it was just them and the person having the seizure, 85% left their booth and sought help within the first minute. When participants believed there was one other person in the group who had also heard what happened, the response rate dropped to 62%. When participants believed there were 4 other people who had all heard the same emergency, the response rate fell to 31%. And the time it took those who did respond to act, the hesitation before they moved, increased significantly. The more people who shared responsibility for responding, the less any individual felt that the responsibility was theirs. This is the second mechanism of the bystander effect, diffusion of responsibility. In a crowd, the moral weight of action is distributed across everyone present, which means each individual carries less of it. And when everyone carries less, sometimes no one carries enough to move. Darley and Latané's findings reframed the Kitty Genovese story entirely. The 38 neighbors who did not call the police were not moral monsters. They were not uniquely indifferent or uniquely cowardly. They were people caught inside precisely the psychological mechanisms that Darley and Latané had mapped in their laboratory. They looked out of their windows and saw other lights coming on. They assumed that someone else had already called. They felt the weight of responsibility lift from their individual shoulders the moment they registered that others were also witnessing the same thing. The very thing that should have made intervention more likely, the presence of dozens of other witnesses, was the thing that made it less likely. The crowd did not amplify the response. It diluted it. It is worth noting that the Kitty Genovese story has itself been revisited and complicated by later journalism. Some researchers have argued that the original New York Times report overstated the number of witnesses and the clarity of what they saw. The full truth of that night may be somewhat more ambiguous than the version that launched Darley and Latané's research. But this much is certain: the psychological mechanisms they discovered are real. They have been replicated hundreds of times in dozens of countries across an enormous range of scenarios. The bystander effect exists. It is powerful, and it kills people. The ethical concerns surrounding these experiments are genuine. Participants in the seizure study believed, for a real and frightening period of time, that another human being was dying in the next room, and that their response, or lack of it, might determine whether that person survived. The psychological stress of that experience was not simulated. It was real stress, produced by a real belief in a real emergency. Darley and Latané did debrief participants afterward, explaining the setup and confirming that no one had actually been harmed. Most participants reported relief and said they understood the purpose. But the experience of those minutes in the booth, the paralysis, the guilt, the awful uncertainty, was not something that could be fully undone by a conversation after the fact. Against that cost must be placed what the research gave the world: an understanding of a mechanism that operates silently and invisibly every time a crowd gathers around an emergency and no one acts. Knowledge that has directly informed emergency response training, public health campaigns, and bystander intervention programs that have saved lives. Whether that trait is justified is a question each person must answer for themselves. But the knowledge once gained cannot be unknowed. The bystander effect is one of those findings that feels, once you understand it, like it should be taught to every human being before they are old enough to find themselves in a crowd, because it operates on all of us. Not just on urban strangers or morally compromised neighbors. On you, in your workplace when a colleague is being treated unfairly and everyone around you is staying quiet. On you, in your community, when something wrong is happening in plain sight and the crowd's silence feels like permission to remain silent yourself. On you, in the smallest moments, the ones that don't make the news but that define quietly and cumulatively what kind of person you are choosing to be. The antidote that Darley and Latané identified is precise and practical. It works by dismantling the two mechanisms, pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility, directly. The first step is to name the emergency clearly and specifically. Not someone help in, but you in the red jacket call an ambulance right now. The moment you single out an individual, you collapse the diffusion. The responsibility is no longer distributed across the crowd. It belongs to one person. And one person, it turns out, is almost always enough. The second step is to act first yourself, to be the person who moves before the crowd has decided what the crowd is doing. One person standing up, stepping forward, picking up the phone, does for others exactly what the dissenting participant did in Milgram's study. It gives them permission. It breaks the spell of collective inaction. It shows them that the situation is, in fact, an emergency, and that someone is treating it as one. You do not need to be brave. You do not need to be exceptional. You just need to move first. Kitty Genovese died on a street in Queens in 1964, and her death became one of the most consequential events in the history of social psychology. Not because of what it proved about human cruelty, but because of what it prompted two researchers to discover about human nature, about the invisible architecture of inaction, about the gap between who we believe we are and what we actually do when the crowd is watching. That gap is not a fixed feature of the human character. It is a situational trap, one that can be sprung, dismantled, and stepped around once you know it is there. That closes Chapter 4. We have been with the Eagles and the Rattlers. We have worn the collar in Jane Elliott's classroom. We have sat in the booth and heard a voice go silent and felt the terrible weight of a crowd deciding what we do next. In Chapter 5, we leave the group behind entirely and go somewhere more intimate and more frightening, into the individual self, into the question of who we are at our most fundamental level and what happens when science decides it knows better. We begin with a baby named David, a botched medical procedure, and a psychologist named John Money who believed that gender was entirely a matter of how you raised a child. That is the story of David Reimer, and it is one of the most heartbreaking in this entire series. Subscribe so you're here for it. Leave a comment. Has knowing about the bystander effect changed how you think you would act in an emergency? I want to hear your honest answer, and thank you as always for being here. I'll see you in the next one.